Fred Andersson, thank you so much for coming on the show. Could you give us a brief biography of yourself, please?
Of course. Yeah, like you said, my name is Fred. I'm a Swedish researcher and author and television freelancer who's been active in television for close to 20 years now. And the last couple of years, mainly focused on research on the paranormal subject, basically. Mm-hmm. And I recently published a book in the United States called Northern Lights, High Strangeness in Sweden. So yeah, that's kind of a very compressed version of me, I'd say.
I'm looking at my notes here, and the first note I have is fabulous moustache, and you do have a very good moustache there. I have to. I don't see many of the the twist up kind of ones anymore. You've done it well.
It was even longer before. I had like a real a couple of twirls here, like a spiral, but. I got tired after, day after day waking up, and you had this chaos in the face. You had to deal with it. So it's a bit shorter now,
Yeah. No, it's good.
I'm very happy about it.
One thing I've noticed, because I found out about you, it was completely random, actually. I was just browsing through Medium. I sort of hadn't really looked at Medium before. And, I can't remember what I typed in, like High Strangeness, something like that, into Medium, and I was like, oh, okay, and I found all these stories. And the thing that kind of struck me was that, because they're all from Sweden, and you don't really hear a lot of stories from these other countries. It's always the UK, the US, the kind of superpowers or whatever that you hear from, especially from the English-speaking sides of things. But what I think is great about what you're doing is you're kind of really you're sort of almost doing like a John Keel style, bringing these kind of Swedish stories to light, sort of thing. Why do you think it is that it's, we mostly hear about, US and UK and that kind of thing, and not places like Sweden? Because there must be these sort of things happening in every country.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I from the beginning when I started with this and reading on the subject as a kid, I basically only heard about the United States specifically, sometimes the UK, sometimes France. But when I got more involved in UFO Sverige is the main UFO organization here. I started to dig in their archives and their magazines and talked with people, and I realized that there's so much more than bright dots in the sky, or we have a lot of ghost stories and such. But why? I mean, the United States and UK is of course bigger, and English is some kind of international language. Mm-hmm. But I also think that Sweden and the Swedish people are a little bit more shy in telling these things. We but people have a tendency to keep it to themselves until you ask. So it's quite tricky to get people to talk about this, to contact UFO Sverige, or you really have to talk with them. You need to sit down, and talk about other things basically until it comes out, these stories. So I think it's just the culture itself, the people. They always say that Sweden is very secular. It's a rational country. It's quite straightforward and everything like that. And yeah, that might be true to a part, at least. But if you go outside the big cities, you'll find tons of stories, very much rooted in folklore, and you hear about critters and elves and gnomes, and even UFOs, because there's a lot of it. But I have no real good explanation why we don't hear more about Sweden or other countries, non-English speaking countries. But yeah, there is a lot of stuff to dig into, for sure.
Yeah, it's I think, do you think a lot of it might be because people are kind of embarrassed about, you're saying about people not talking about the stories, like, do you think it might be like people are embarrassed that people are going to mock them in, publicly, or
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've been talking to hundreds of witnesses the last years, both when it comes to ghosts and UFOs, and many are very very afraid to be mocked. There is, especially with the UFOs and high strangeness, this weirder stuff. There is this stigma surrounding it. It's kind of starting to get better, actually. The last 5-6 years, I noticed a slight change, but it's I don't think people want to admit that they've gone beyond the consensus, reality or rational thinking. Many people feel silly, kind of, to admit it. It's like they're being naked for the first time about their experience, and I think that's very very common, definitely. And it's also this thing that I think is pretty accurate for Swedish people, that when something has happened to them, they don't, they feel like, no, it's some kind of, they don't want to be special or seem unique. They want to keep a quite low profile, because we have something called jantelagen in Sweden. It's just a symbolic thing that you shouldn't believe that you're someone. You don't raise your voice too high. Don't let yourself be seen too much.
There's a similar thing in Denmark, actually, isn't there? I think it might even be the same. Yeah. I don't think it's the same word, but I remember I was watching a documentary about Nicholas Winding Refn, the director, and his wife said exactly that same thing. She said that, there's this kind of culture there where you don't raise yourself kind of above everybody else. And and that had a similar name, I think. But it's interesting. So have you had your own kind of encounters or experiences with anything?
Yeah, I often say, when I get this question, I always say, no, I haven't experienced anything at all. But then I start thinking, and there's like 4 or 5 things I've experienced. Most of them, I'd say, has to do with ghosts. And honestly, I'm a bit skeptical about ghosts as spirits or, dead relatives or something. But there is something out there, absolutely. Mm-hmm. Once while shooting a paranormal show, I saw in broad daylight a black, solid, shadow person, basically, very, very solid. You could see the head and shoulders and everything. It was a great experience. It wasn't scary or anything, but finally I saw what other people saw, what they told me about. And some years ago, we were out barbecuing, near a field out in the forest, just by the edge of the field. And we were like 4 people, and out on the field, this was late at night, we see a big, bright circle of light in the field. You didn't see any beam or anything like that. It was just a big circle of light in the field. And the odd thing that we were a bit, perplexed. What is this? But no one took photos of it. No one, I have photos from the evening, but all photos are, just cropped so you don't see the circle area. It's so typical. It's ridiculous, because I always tell people, take photos, do whatever, something. So I had a couple of those experiences, and I had... my life is sometimes an orgy of synchronicities. Of course, it's like, come on, it's absurd sometimes. And I had twice something I would say like premonitions in dreams. That I dreamt during night that the thing I would do the next day would be cancelled. And often I wake up and I check my phone and there's a message saying, no, it's cancelled, we won't do it. And we're talking big things like cancelling shows, cancelling TV series, or, these big things. So that's kind of I don't have those big, amazing experiences, but I would love to have.
Yeah, I'm sort of similar. I've had some weird experiences. They're not really. I don't think I've ever spoken about them on the show, but anyway, I won't go into them now. But I had some experiences where, at first glance, I thought, oh, it's because there's one instance where I hit my head and then saw something, and then another instance where I observed something happening. And but it's one of those things where when I look back at it, I was like, actually, hang on, that was a bit strange. That was a bit. So who are your?
It's odd, this thing that. Yeah, sorry.
No, go on.
No, I find it so odd, this thing that the reaction often comes afterwards. At least in my case, it seems a little bit in your case. Like you see something, you feel something, and then hours later, or days later, or years after, it's like, what was that? And I find it. Probably because these experiences are so out of the ordinary, it's something so unusual that maybe you have a hard time processing it, or difficult time to process it. I don't know why it's like that.
Yeah, it's strange, isn't it? Maybe it's like maybe you have to process it through some kind of filter in your mind, and then you have this kind of realization. It is strange. Who would you say your influences are in terms of research and things like that? I mentioned John Keel earlier on because I was kind of struck a little bit. It felt quite Keelish at times, your style,
Yeah.
but
I must admit that Keel is a huge inspiration to me. I mean, I read all this stuff, at least the books, and it's whenever I dive into a Keel book, because I often reread them, I get the sense that I'm entering some kind of adventure, some kind of high strangeness adventure. It's like gonzo journalism sometimes, especially Mothman Prophecies, of course, but all his books are like he's in it, he's exploring it, he's speculating. Sometimes it's insane, sometimes it's right on the spot. So Keel, absolutely. Jacques Vallée, definitely. Love the guy. Then in Sweden we have two people I really look up to, and I count them as friends nowadays. One of them is Claes Svan, who's the what do you say? He's the leader of the board. What do you say in English? The board member of UFO Sverige, but he's the chairman. Yeah. And he's a great journalist and writer. He's quite rational. He's kind of the opposite of me, because I can be quite wild, to be honest. But Claes kind of keeps me down a little bit. And then you have Håkan Blomqvist, who's Sweden's and maybe one of the world's best experts on the esoteric part of ufology, contactee persons and UFO religions, and the spiritual part, spiritism, everything like that. Amazing people and great writing. He's published a couple of books, and they have a good blog in English with super interesting texts.
I have to look up that. I mean, I'm always. It's actually one of the questions I had here was. There seems to be a kind of rise in interest in kind of this crossover between the occult and the paranormal at the moment, whereas the occult has always tried to kind of distance itself in the past from, any kind of paranormal or UFO kind of stuff. It's like no, we're it's almost like a science. We can't possibly be seen. Whereas now I'm starting to see that it's bleeding into each other again in terms of you have people like Alan Greenfield writing. Secret Cipher of the Ufonauts, that kind of thing, where it is that kind of crossover point between the occult and the paranormal. Mm-hmm. And have you encountered much of that in Sweden as well? Is there, or generally in your research, have you seen this kind of crossover happening?
Well, I think most of the cases I've researched have a strong occult vibe, or esoteric vibe, that there is something else than a physical object or a physical humanoid or creature showing up. UFO Sverige, where I'm very involved, has a very rational way. We're neither debunkers or true believers. We're kind of in the middle road there. and trying to see every part, the whole spectra of the phenomenon. So in our discussions, it's very easy to talk about the non-material aspects of a UFO encounter and and such things. And I think that has grown larger, bigger at least. If you look back at the 70s and maybe early 80s in Sweden, it was very much, physical ETs landing in the backyards of innocent farmers. While after that, it kind of have been more blur between the lines. And I personally, I probably, when I was younger, was more into the ET hypothesis, they're coming from space and landing. But the more I've read, the more people I talked with, to be honest, I have a really hard time believing that there would be physical crafts landing here. There is something else. I think it's deeply connected to us humans and our way of thinking, our perception of everything, of course, affected by the culture and everything around us. So I think it's slowly starting to change, but we try to keep a quite neutral path, at least inside the organization. Mm-hmm. But privately, when you talk to people, there's more space for discussions and theories. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's I wonder. I mean, another thing that seems to be quite popular at the moment is the C5 meditation UFO thing. I don't know very much about it. I've only recently I know it's been around for ages, but I've kind of only recently started to look into it. Have you had any experiences with the C5 thing? And could you explain what it actually is? I don't actually know really that much about it.
You kind of go out, I haven't done it myself, but you kind of go out together with people you trust, and you sit in a circle and you basically meditate. You're focusing your consciousness or whatever to whatever is up there. And CE5 has actually recently, maybe the last 2 years, started to grow here in Sweden with CE5 groups and people who are very, very interested in this. Though, I must be honest, I'm quite skeptical about Stephen Greer. I am, like many other people, but I'm attracted to the idea that he, to be fair, had made very, popular over the years. This way of communicating with some kind of intelligence, whatever that intelligence is. But I've been outside many nights during the summer and sitting there and looking up at the night sky, the stars, and just kind of hoping to see something. And sometimes you see something. You see a strange light, or maybe sometimes it's just satellites or whatever. But sometimes there has been these flashes of light, which I know they describe a lot within CE5, which I find, very fascinating. Maybe it's a natural thing, or maybe it's something manifested by my own wishes and thoughts. I don't know. I'm not, even if I'm not belonging the Greer fan club. I like the idea, and I hope that one day I can try it out with people I trust and I think there's something in it, whatever that is.
Yeah, it seems at the moment. Do you think? Obviously, the thing to kind of bring up with you, we haven't actually mentioned it on the show really yet, is the the hearing recently in the United States. How have you been following that? I assume you have been following that, and
yeah, I've been. My interest is high strangeness, the weird stuff, but I need to keep my ears and eyes open for what's happening over this whole Grush affair, and the Ryan Graves and David Fravor recently. They were sitting, and someone used a made-up word. All words are made up, of course. Skeptimistic, he called it. He's skeptimistic. I'm skeptical because I still feel this is something that has happened before. You have a whistleblower with relaying information that might be planted for one reason or another. But then again, it also triggers my imagination because it's such a huge thing within this field, within this. It's kind of bizarre, in this day and age, that someone goes out and say that, hey, we have bodies, we have crafts, everything. I don't know. What do you think about it?
Yeah, I'm kind of the same. It's like, it's just words again until we see something. It's just, it's it's just a guy saying stuff. It's kind of the way I sort of see it, until I see the craft. It's like, I'm not even particularly skeptical, but when it comes to, we've just had this so many times with whistleblowers, and we've had some crazy ones in the past. Like, what was the is it El Duce, or I can never pronounce it, the American, we did a show on it, I forgot what it's called. El Juice, is it? Or El Dolce, is that it?
The mountain range.
Where there's like a secret war going on under the under the mountain, and it's like, again, show me something. It's like,
show me something. Show me the goods. Do you know that there's some photos being leaked from this base? I've seen quite low resolution photos that people claim is from the alien base under Dulce, and those photos is actually from the Stockholm subway.
Oh, okay.
So it's like so it was, when I saw them the first time, I said, "Oh, it's Tensta. That's a central station, basically." And yes, we have very beautiful subway in Stockholm, but it's not alien. I can assure you.
That'd be I don't know if that's a compliment or a Stockholm looks a bit like an alien base or something.
Yeah,
a bit strange. One thing in your media, I sort of sent you a list of kind of the stuff I wanted to talk about. But one thing it occurred to me as I was driving here is that you wrote about the Men in Black as well, and that's something I find particular because they feel very much like an occult kind of thing. Mm-hmm. The more you read about them, the more bizarre and strange the stories get. And could you talk a little bit about kind of some cases in Sweden of the Men in Black? And you had some kind of encounter as well, didn't you? Potentially.
Yeah, potentially. Yeah. First of all, I mean, there's not many Men in Black cases in Sweden. The cases that exist are kind of vague. It could be just weird people or misunderstanding, or it could be Men in Black, of course. I'd say that the most famous one in Swedish UFO history is the one that Bevan Thorvaldsen experienced at the beginning of the 70s. He later became the chairman of UFO Sverige. And he had a UFO sighting, and he talked about it in the newspaper. This was early 70s. And the day after the article was published, a man came knocking on his door, and this was far out in the countryside in Sweden. And remember, in Sweden in the early 70s, you rarely saw foreigners, people who, everyone was, blonde, basically. So suddenly there's a guy knocking on his door who have a slight Asian look, and a bit, pale complexion, skin complexion, and he talks weird, and he kind of feels curious, but the only thing he do is that he asks for which direction to go, and there's like just one road outside the house, and he came from one side, so Bevan pointed the opposite direction. And the guy walked out on the road and disappeared. I mean, he was gone in seconds, basically. For Bevan, this was something truly remarkable, something that stood out from his little, countryside life. It might not sound so spectacular here, but it's one of those things that really set off his whole interest. It was something that stood out so much for him. Maybe like 1 or 2 years later, Jan-Ove Sundberg, who was a Swedish ufologist and cryptozoologist, claimed that he had experienced Men in Black who were terrorizing him. He had a UFO encounter at Loch Ness. He was out there researching the monster Nessie, and suddenly he encountered a flying saucer standing there in a meadow with some humanoids outside. And he of course, it was a big shock, and he went home, and afterwards he saw and felt and heard strange men dressed in black in his garden. They were calling him, they were terrorizing him, basically. With Jan Ove, it's important to say that for some people, many people who knew him consider him completely bonkers, insane also. There was part of his stories that were really interesting, but he had a tendency to exaggerate things enormously, So he wrote a whole book about USOs, underwater UFOs in Sweden, because we had this big submarine craze, submarine flap in the 80s, and he wanted to connect these to submarines, UFOs. And there he started to collect weird meetings, weird encounters with frogmen, with divers. So it's some kind of underwater men in black that came up on land, and they asked really weird questions. They could stand on the shoreline or just a few meters from the shoreline and ask where the water is, for example, or what time cycle they were in. And they always had this kind of paler complexion in the skin, sometimes an overly generic Swedish accent. It's not even traditional. It's just too perfect, like they've been practicing it, in some way. So he collected I think almost 20 of these encounters during the 80s. Some of them, if you can trust him, are quite weird. There were some weird guys in diving suits coming up, talking with dog owners and people who had parked their cars to look at the sea. Very interesting. I'd say my favorite, and maybe the really only true Men in Black story I know about, is the one about Ante Johansson. Ante Jonsson. Ante Jonsson was a contactee. He had an amazing experience in 1984 where he got attacked by hooded dwarves that came out from a black UFO. There's actually one collaborating witness to this also, which makes it even more interesting. So he had many, many years of contacts with these space beings from planet Prio. And when he passed away, he lived at a retirement home. So when his family was coming to get his stuff, his thousands of pages of notes from his space adventures, the staff at the retirement home tells them that two men in black suits had already been there and took all the space stuff, and it disappeared, which is, it's quite weird. It's an odd detail. Some of these papers have shown up in odd places after this, but most of it kind of disappeared. It's kind of a fitting end for Ante, because he had this lifetime of experience, and Men in Black came and stole his stuff at the end.
Yeah, and you had your own kind of experience, didn't you, as well? Which is, yeah.
Yeah, whenever I tell this story, it kind of feels like, but but when I experienced it, it was super weird, because I at the time I was researching Swedish Men in Black stories. I was communicating with other researchers to see if they had something. And one day when I was walking home in the middle of this, I passed a man. And I could sense, that he stopped behind me, and I turned around a little bit, and I noticed that he had turned completely around and he was looking at me, and he was kind of standing, like lifeless, just standing with his arms down. And then he started to walk after me, and I was like, okay, I will, I walked home. I stopped in a park to turn around. And he was like 20 meters behind me, just standing still once again. He wasn't even walking. He was just standing there. It was like, So I go home, do some other stuff, kind of forgets about it. A few hours later, first of all, I see the cats reacting to something out in the hallway. they're like curious. So I go and I see the door handle moving slowly.
Oh man, that's like horror movie stuff.
And, and I looked out what you saw the hole in the door. I don't remember the English language name for it, but I looked out and I saw this man standing, this close to the door, and he was still moving the handle. And I opened the door, very brave of me, and asked, "So are you looking for someone?" And he only said, "Luam." And I said, "The Luam? I don't know what you're talking about." And he said, "Luam." And I said, "No, I figured out maybe it's a name or something." So I said, "No, there's no Luam here." So I closed the door, and he stood there for an hour more, directly outside the door. And I opened again, and he said, "Luam." And soon he left, and then he started to turn up at our doorstep in the middle of the night. He tried to get inside the apartment, and he always talked about Luam. One night I found him outside the balcony. At the time I was smoking, so I was standing in the balcony, and I kind of looked out, looked over the edge, and I could see him in the darkness down there, his white eyes.
Oh, something creeps me out.
Yeah. So that maybe went on for a month. After a while, it was like normal. I came home from work, and he was standing outside the door, and after a while, I just decided, I'm not going to react to this. And then he disappeared. So, of course, I was researching Men in Black, so I made this connection. And then I started to get paranoid. I did Luam in the Secret Cipher, the Alan Greenfield. And it was just words like lurking and shadows and, those eerie words. And then I realized that Luam is just a different spelling of Lam. Of course, the gray entity that Aleister Crowley communicated with once. You see the paranoia, the conspiracy thoughts.
It could have been. It could have been like an egregore or a tulpa or some sort of thought form. Did you ever see the guy again? Or
I think I saw him a bit later walking into another door in some other house nearby, but I haven't seen him since. I have no idea. Maybe, like you said, he was an egregore, or maybe he had, some problems of some kind, and just, But here again, I think I've written an article about it or mentioned it. I have this idea that the phenomenon can take proxies, human proxies or alien proxies. So you can say that Men in Black or this guy, in a way, is a part of the phenomenon. It wants to be seen, so it kind of takes whatever it has around to show itself, which makes everything even stranger. I did. Sorry, you made me talk here. I feel I'm talking so much.
Oh, no. That's what you're here for. Got you here to talk.
I had a number of years ago, I did mushrooms, which is highly illegal in Sweden. And you hear that?
Yeah. Doesn't stop us from doing them, though, does it?
No, I've never done it. It's just a long time. And it was a very nice trip. It wasn't that strong, but I was, of course, out in nature, and I encountered a wooden bridge over a little stream. And on that stream, on the bridge, stood a very short, chubby man with gigantic pants and bulging eyes, And he stood there with a fishing rod, and he was looking at me when I was passing him. So, okay, a weird guy I saw on mushrooms. The next time I took mushrooms, he showed up again, this time hiding behind some kind of electrical thing in the center of my town. He was just standing there looking at me. And the third time I encountered him inside a store, and he was looking at me again, also with some kind of substance in me. I'm sure he was a real person. He just looked odd. But for me, it was odd that he showed himself, that we met every time I did psychedelics. Yeah. It was like a gnome or something,
I was struck by something when you were talking about one of the cases earlier. You said about this guy that kind of took a story and sort of took it a bit too far almost. Like, and I was struck when you said that even with Keel, that kind of happened, didn't it? With, what's his name? Is it Woodrow Guthrie? Is that the guy that... in the Indrid Cold.
Derenberger.
Derenberger, that's it. Yeah. Not Guthrie. I'm sure that's somebody else completely. But anyway, but yeah, and I think Keel said that with the Indrid Cold story, he believed the initial story, you know, and then I've forgotten his name again already. Is it Derenberger? He then put a book out, didn't he? And it kind of really, it's a bit. Have you read it? I don't know if you've read it, but it's,
no, I actually never read it, but I know the story. Yeah,
and it's kind of there's all these people called like Carl, and they all have very English-sounding names, and like the planet sounds very, suspiciously like our own planet, but a bit weirder. And then his daughter eventually wrote a book called Beyond Lanulus, because Lanulus being the planet that the Indrid Cold's apparently from. And I read that recently, and it feels like, have you spotted this as well, that often if you look at the kind of base story, that feels like the most credible, the initial story, and then you read these kind of elaborations on that story, and they suddenly become a little bit less believable. But is that something you spotted as well, or?
Oh yeah, absolutely, yeah, sure. I'm in. With the book I wrote, for example, I went back to the original reports, the original witness testimonies, and they have the basis of them are kind of similar, but in many cases, when you start reading other books and other articles and new interviews, suddenly there's a much larger story, coming from them, added and retracted stuff. But I like that. As long as you're aware of it, but I love how the mythology grows around these things. And now we're going woo-woo, because I feel that by this mythology growing, it kind of creates its own reality. It somehow becomes real, because people are claiming stuff. We can't prove it's either that or this, but they're claiming it, and suddenly it's part of the mythology, it's part of their lives. And then other people start to experience stuff connected to the new mythology. I find that so intriguing. I love when that happens.
Yeah, it's almost like people are willing things into existence almost. The classic example of that was the Slender Man incident, wasn't it? Where you have this kind of giant internet thought form that suddenly seems to have become corporeal, and people see it all of a sudden. Yeah.
Yeah, it's an excellent example. Have you ever seen the documentary A Self-Induced Hallucination? It's very, very hard to get nowadays. It's made by one Jane Schoenbraun, I think. And it's only edited from YouTube videos, basically.
Oh, okay.
So she took material from others, and she kind of tells the story of Slender Man through people who have experienced him or talks about it. It's an amazing deep dive into exactly this, the thought manifestations, the egregores, whatever you want to call it. But it's absolutely impossible to find. I've seen it once, and it's gone. So probably because of copyright issues nowadays. But if you ever find it, grab it.
Yeah, the bane of YouTube, that is. But the copyright strike. Yeah, no, a friend of mine, a good friend of ours, Joseph Maffini, who we've had on the show before as well, created a alternate reality, the original alternate reality game called Ong's Hat. I don't know if you've ever heard of that before.
Yes, I've heard.
Yeah, and he found that as the game was moving along, and as the mythology was building, people sort of really it sort of took hold of them, and it got to a point where he actually had to end the game because it was becoming so it was sort of taking over his life a bit and becoming quite almost problematic. And even when he sort of confessed to it, it was this was all an experiment in mythology, or people just won't let it go. And it's still to this day, people will not let that go. They believe it is real, and they start to find evidence of that this thing's real. And it's Joe made it up, and it's so strange, isn't it?
It's super strange. This reminds me, I think it's in Cosmic Trigger where Robert Anton Wilson writes about this, because they wrote the Illuminati's trilogy and the whole Illuminati mythology and all of those things. And I think he mentioned somewhere that suddenly people started to call him, claiming there were like Illuminati representatives from certain cities, and he's kind of have this. It's both a scary thought and kind of fun thought that this is happening. It kind of it's in one way there is the mythology is manifested into our reality in that way. I do not remember the details here, but it just came up now when you were mentioning it.
Yeah, it seems to be when you present someone with a mythology that they really invest in, it's very difficult to unentangle them from that mythology. There was a really good documentary actually I saw called The Institute. I don't know if you've ever seen that before. It's about a guy in San Francisco who created an ARG, and it's very esoteric and mystical, and all these people got very involved in it. And at first I wasn't sure if it was like a mockumentary, like it was like a film within a film kind of thing, but it actually apparently did actually happen. This kind of huge, like massive ARG that happened in San Francisco. And at the end, when they finally revealed, oh look, you've been playing a game, people got angry. They were really emotionally invested, and it sounds just like what happened with Joe's Ong's hat thing. It's so strange, but yeah, I mean, I guess if you've really invested a lot of time in something and you find out it's not real, I can imagine that would be quite grating.
I guess so. Anyway, I'm super fascinated just by this stuff. I love the idea that things like this can happen. It's a disturbing thought also, of course, but there is something. I think there's probably many examples regarding Bigfoot and other monsters in the United States, especially, where it started off as a hoax. Someone tried to do a joke with someone, got some kind of gorilla suit, and suddenly it's real. People continue to see it. Love it.
Yeah, no, it's great. You mentioned valet earlier on. What is your sort of take on the kind of ultra-terrestrial? Actually, could you say, because we've mentioned it a couple of times on the show, but we've never sort of described what the ultra-terrestrial hypothesis is.
Yeah.
Could you explain it at all? Because
I think it's quite tricky to explain, because I feel it's quite, it's kind of an umbrella for different things. But as I see it, the ultra-terrestrial, it's some kind of dimensional thing. They kind of live and exist either here beside us in some different form of light spectrum or whatever, or they're actually traveling here. At least if I get Keel right. The Eighth Tower is a book I love, for example.
Oh yeah. Classic.
I'm kind of just what does it mean really? But but with Valet, he talks a lot about, or he did talk a lot about the control system, that these things comes from what he calls maybe a natural control system, or even some kind of technological control system, or made by some kind of intelligence, or just existing, that kind of uses the phenomenon to push mankind in different directions. It pushes our technology or experiences or intellect or whatever. I'm not sure I agree on that, but I find it a very interesting hypothesis, absolutely, especially since we all know how the phenomenon has changed over the years. Here in Sweden, we have so many stories about gnomes and fairies, and of course, even in the UK, and who's very, very similar to modern times and the aliens and flying saucers. It just depends on our perception, basically, on the culture around us. And I kind of lean maybe more towards that as an explanation to what's going on out there. But then again, that's no answer at all, because I still don't know what it is.
It is.
It's just happening.
Let's talk a little bit about some of your, because obviously, like I said, I haven't managed to get your book yet. I have ordered it. Just hasn't turned up yet. But I was hoping to get it before the interview, and I was going to speed read it today. But no, it didn't show up in time. But I do read your Medium articles, and there's some fascinating stuff. And one of them was the flaming kind of encounters people had with like fiery beings, and that one really. No pun intended, inflamed my imagination. But sorry, that was like a dad joke. I'm sorry, it wasn't meant to.
It's fine with dad jokes. I'm okay with that. Yeah.
But could you walk us through the stories? Because there's two specific stories, and they seem to link up. And there's one of them in particular about where there's like a sort of cabinet was really interesting. But
yeah, absolutely. Both these incidents happened in 1978, and up I can't say the northern parts of Sweden, but higher up than Stockholm, at least, in Mörsil and Sundsvall. So it's still up north. And the first one was a teenage boy who was on his way home from a party, some kind of barbecue by the beach, and he decides to take a shortcut over a cow field. And first he noticed how the cows are scared and runs away, maybe because of him, I don't know. But he continues and sees a bright, strong, flaming, sparkling light on the side of the field, and he looks in that direction. And on that place, there's an old World War II bunker. So the light, basically, this burning light basically comes out from the opening of it. And in front of this light, he sees this, in Swedish UFO magazines from the 70s, they call it a humanoid. I mean, it's a silhouette, it's a black silhouette of a tall man with a helmet with a point, with a spike kind of on the top, like this World War One, old German helmets. And it's such a strong, bright light. Of course, he gets scared. He runs away. He meets a friend who also had seen this light from a bit further distance. And of course, when they come back the next day or 2 days later with investigators, there's absolutely no trace of any kind of flammable material or anything like that. Like a month later, a very similar event happens in Sundsvall. Once again, it's a teenage girl, I think is in her late teens, who is out jogging, and she jogs into a forest and she turns around, and on the way back, she sees, like you said, kind of like a cabinet, like you can call it portal, inside the forest. And inside this portal, still you have this burning bright light. She sees a black silhouette that kind of moves sideways, seemingly out from this cabinet. And after that, she hears, noises in the nature around. And of course, she gets scared, runs home, gets her mother, and they go back. And of course, there's nothing there. And they're very, very similar events in that way. There's both are in the evening, both is teenagers, alone, nature around. You have the silhouette, a tall man's figure, probably. I don't know what to make of these stories because they kind of doesn't really fit the normal UFO story.
That's what's so fascinating about it. It's like, it's not like it almost sounds like jinn, doesn't it? It sounds like, yeah. And it, like you say, it's like normally people will see a figure or like a shadowy figure or a grey type, alien or whatever, but you don't normally hear flames. That's the
flames, and they kind of almost like in a frame. They're framed by this opening. In one case, it's the bunker opening, and in the second, it's like this etheric cabinet standing there out in the forest. My thought was also the jinn and similar, fire creatures that live within the fire or the bright lights. We had stories like this in Sweden, of course. Mostly connected to, once again, I don't know the English name for it, but when you make coal, you kind of you burn wood, so you make coal. and these were extremely hot fireplaces. It kind of looks like a hut, basically. So with a hole at the top, and you were kind of burning the wood inside. And there was always this warning that there was these fire creatures that could take you if you weren't careful enough. You could fall into this, for example. And I mean, there's even stories about some kind of spirit in the glow of the fire, some kind of more nature spirit that belongs there. And I can understand that, because we've all been sitting in front of the afterglow from a fire, and look at the patterns and the crackling sounds. And yeah, I agree, it's hypnotic, basically.
It's so, like fire itself's kind of alive, isn't it?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It's a living being. Yeah, and it's a powerful living being. We had this realization several times when you're sitting there and you're out in the forest, and you look at the fire and you realize that, if we don't look after the fire, if we don't take care of it, this can destroy the whole area. I mean, it's such a powerful force, and maybe that's, part of the experience here. It's such a primitive force of nature, of life that's happening. I haven't been able to trace these teenagers. I guess they would be around in their 60s now or something. How it affected them, because that's something I'm very curious on. What did this experience tell them? Did it change their viewpoint on things? Because of course that's what happens sometimes. But in these cases, they're so weird. I don't know where to put them.
Yeah, it's strange. So did they? In the area where they were seen, these sort of fiery, was there any kind of other events that could be linked into it, like a crash or some kind of, often sometimes when people see phenomena, if you look at the kind of history or the news locally in that area, there's some kind of indicator sometimes of something. Was there any kind of links to that, or?
Well, no. The investigators at the time didn't find anything. Then again, they kind of thought it was kind of alien, but they didn't find anything that pointed at a prank or an accident or some kind of event. The first case with the boy, there was this idea maybe his friends were pranking him, but they had no idea which they knew the direction. But there are many different roads. There's forests, there's fields. It's just unlikely that they would, get there faster than him and prepare this elaborate joke.
Yeah, it's quite an extreme joke, that was.
Yeah, it's like, wow.
Yeah, no, it's definitely fascinating. The other one, I'm probably going to absolutely butcher this name here. You might have to help me. Is it Vic Bolundert? Vic Bolundert? I'm terrible with this stuff.
It's like Vik Bolandet.
Vic Bolandet. Oh, I wasn't that far off. That's close enough. Could you tell us a bit about this incident? Because there's actually, I've got an interesting parallel with this story that I'll tell you afterwards. But could you walk us through this one? Because this one really interested me a lot.
Yeah, this was, I think it was during the autumn of 73 or 74, where a man was going to their summer cabin, in the autumn. But they already had a cabin out there in this beautiful area with wilderness and fields and a sea and everything, archipelago. And he's there with his father, who's a little bit elderly and have a problem with his hearing. So they stop the car at the designated place for cars, and they hear a loud bang, And the guy, he runs out from the car and he's like, what's going on? And he runs towards the direction he thought the loud bang was coming from, the kind of like an explosion. And it's like 100 meters, 200 meters. And when he comes there, there's a field. On the other side of the field, he see a group of, you could call them green humanoids with antennas on their head and big black eyes. And they're kind of floating above the ground. And they kind of, minding their own business there. And they stop and they look at him. and he's frightened by this, and then this group of odd creatures continues, and they walk towards the forest and kind of just disappears, not into the forest, but just like they phase in and out of our reality. I first heard about this story through Albert S. Rosales, who collects humanoid stories from all over the world, which is an amazing collection of so much weirdness. So I decided to trace this story because I felt that, it's a cool story. It's a very interesting story, but I'd love to read the original report. And the only clue I had was there was a kind of comic book sketch belonging to this sketch or drawing belonging to this story. And I felt that, this is kind of similar. It's not just a stolen image or anything. It might belong to the story itself. So I started to send out this drawing to everyone I know in the field. I said, "Do you recognize the artist? Do you know who might have drew this?" Because no one knew about this story. No one had any kind of memory of it. And sooner or later, someone said, "That's Richard Svensson." And Richard Svensson is a folklorist and a cryptozoologist in Sweden, and a very, very good illustrator himself. So through that, I could trace the story to in which issue of UFO Aktuellt it was. They wrote about it. And from there, I could identify kind of what year, kind of where. And I managed to find the original report as the witness, originally made once upon a time. And the story itself, he told, is basically the same, except that the humanoids, the green humanoids, seem to wear helmets with antennas on. And you notice that the story itself had been a little bit more, how do I say it, more commercialized, more simplified. I for one find it still very intriguing. I was reading the papers and report, and there was some speculation that he might have seen hunters in the area from in a distance. I personally believe that in the area they had military exercises during these years. So he might have seen a troop of soldiers, basically, with helmets and equipment. And for some reason, saw them as green humanoids, like classic green men.
But wasn't there like a real disparity between the heights as well, though? There was.
Yes, absolutely. I forgot about that. Yeah, some kind of look like children, or the size of children, and then adults. Which kind of, if that's correct, kind of doesn't fit into the soldier theory or even the hunter theory. You're very correct about that. So I love this story. I find it a very typical humanoid story of Sweden in the 70s. It has everything. It has nature. It has the whole environment. And it already, when I read it from the start, when they were identified as aliens, I felt more that this kind of feels more like, some kind of forest spirits or something more from folklore. But once again, it's hard to say after so many years what the truth is. What did he really see? I still feel that he had an experience, and once again, it was an experience that affected him deeply. It was something he never forgot. And I also think that's the most important thing about it, because it meant something to him. It gave him something that he carried with him. And I find that way more interesting than, I find the human experience way more interesting than, debunking or, it's a natural explanation of some kind. So it's a good story, and it's one of those places I would like to go and explore myself, to take a look at it. It probably looks quite different now, of course.
But wasn't there a second story as well, though, that lined up with that one? Or am I?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's called the lingonberry encounter. It's called. It's. Find it a bit tricky to talk about, not because it's controversial or anything like that, because it's quite. You have to read the original report, the original letter, because that's, I'd say, true magic. It's of course in Swedish, the original text. And the version that you can find on the internet is heavily edited. It's a kind of a different story. But in this story, a woman goes out in the forest to pick lingonberries, and she can't find any lingonberries at all. It's completely empty. There's nothing out there. Maybe a mushroom or two, but nothing. And so she's out walking there in the wilderness when she suddenly hears a girl's voice behind him, and she turns back, and two girls, teenage girls, sitting on a log, and they're eating some kind of cake of sorts, and they say hello to her, and she made her excuse that she said sorry that she didn't see them, and they say something like, oh, it's okay, you can walk over us or under us, something like kind of an abstract meaning. And this is in the middle of nowhere, it should be mentioned. And she starts talking with them. And this girl seems overly adult in their talk. They seemed like they've traveled all over the world. And she's very perplexed by the situation, because it's something you don't expect out there. And at the end, she says, the girl says that, okay, now we're going to pick some lingonberries ourselves. And she says goodbye to them, walks a few meters, turns around, and the girls are gone, of course. And then she looks around, and the whole forest is filled with the lingonberries that wasn't there before. Some will say that this is kind of weird alien encounter, but of course not. It's not. It feels like she met elves or gnomes or even trolls. Something from Swedish folklore. It's an intriguing story. It's absolutely impossible to find the original letter or original report. I found the first article that was written about it, and that's basically the only thing I've been able to read, and I don't think I will be able to find anything more about it. But for me, Swedish forests are magical. This is the best forests in the world. You have huge areas of green moss and berries and mushrooms, and it's like entering a different world.
Sounds amazing.
I never get tired of these forests.
Yeah. What struck me when I read that story was, I will find the source, but I couldn't find the source in time. But I remember reading, I don't think it was in Kiel, it was somewhere where it was a soldier that was in Vietnam, and he and his platoon or whatever used to go out into this particular part of the woods, and they'd constantly they'd hear a bang, which is the first thing. It wasn't like an explosion. It wasn't like a claymore going off or whatever. It was some kind of, it apparently sounded like something hitting the earth, like a bang kind of thing, like you said. And then they would see a parade of what originally, the original story, the original account, it was a parade of soldiers, ghostly soldiers walking in front of them. So they'd all, they'd assuming it was the Viet Cong, they'd sort of stop and wait, and they'd see these kind of green-looking soldiers walking past, and then just melting away into the into nothingness kind of thing. And then this guy tells the story to somebody back at camp or whatever, and he's like, "Well, that's weird because we were in this other part of the jungle, heard this giant bang, and we saw." And they said, and this is the bit where when I read your article, I went, "Oh, I've read this before." This guy saw what he said was like what he thought was like an army, but they're all different sizes, like including very, very short and very tall, wearing like helmets with like their faces covered with and I was like, oh my God, it's the same story. When I was reading your thing, it was like, I need to find the source. I've got it. It's in my, I've got like you probably as well. I've got hundreds of books, and it's like I can't remember which book it's in, but I remember because it really struck me at the time, that story. And then when I read your story, I was like, oh my god, it's the same thing. It's like, but in Vietnam.
Goosebumps here.
Yeah,
you need to find this. I need to read about it.
Yeah, because I mean, it's such a such a big link there, but it was like, I couldn't believe that. I was reading it going, I've read this before. Where have I read this before? It was, so let's talk a little bit about Vittangi. I'm going to screw this up again. Is it Vittangi?
Vittangi, yes.
Vittangi, there we go. I'm getting better. But I think first, before we talk about that, we should really quickly, because although a lot of people would have heard of the other two incidences that are kind of similar to this one, but we do have a lot of occult-based guys here that don't, listeners here that don't necessarily know these stories. But can you talk a little bit about Westall High and the Ariel School incidents? And because these feel very in the same ballpark, don't they?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you want to look further into the Ariel School incident, I think it was in 94 or 96. 94, I think it was. There was a couple of hundred school kids who saw, basically started to see a UFO or a flying saucer hovering above their school or around the school. It was kind of jumping around and moving oddly. And it landed in a kind of meadow. It's quite a grassy meadow with trees nearby. And from this ship, which looked very much like a classic flying saucer, there was some odd-looking humanoids coming out. I don't think they saw them actually coming out, but they were standing by the craft. And these creatures had, big black eyes. Some of the kids, there was like 60 witnesses they know about who saw these beings and the UFOs, but the whole school saw it, and some of the adults. These beings were, depending on what child who saw it, it was either had a dark complexion, or it more bright complexion, which is interesting because it kind of feels like it has to do with the perception of the kids, and these characters were kind of moving in slow motion, and one kid described them as moving in a loop. So it was running in slow motion from one part of the field to another, and then it was starting over and did the same thing again, over and over again, which I find extremely intriguing.
Yeah, me too.
And they kind of directly, they were scared. They ran to the teachers, and they had a chance to draw what they saw. And while there is of course differences in what they saw, it's still also pretty similar. You have the basics there with the ship and the humanoids. It was a huge sighting. It's probably one of the biggest and best documented sightings ever, I'd say. Mm-hmm. And there's for those who want to know more, there's a great documentary called The Ariel Phenomenon. I don't know if you've seen it, but
I've not seen it yet. No, I saw there was a documentary years back about it as well. I think it was BBC did one, and maybe I can't. Yeah. I don't think it was Panorama, but I think it was some kind of one-off documentary special about it. I just remember we used to. I think it was in the 90s, sort of late 90s, because we used to, back when British television used to be a lot better, we used to have these things called like weird weekends, where it was almost like a 14 weekend of television where they'd have all sorts of weird stuff on. And I remember seeing a sort of hour-long documentary about it around then. No, I've heard this aerial phenomenon is meant to be excellent, though. It's meant to be a really good film. But
it's good. Yeah, it's. I mean, the documentary have a bias towards aliens or something supernatural, but of course people have tried to debunk this afterwards, that it was a kind of mass hysteria, or that they saw a theater group with dolls, which I find ridiculous because that's just such a stupid idea, but it's a good one. I recommend it. The Westall School event, I don't have so many details here in my head at the moment, but I think it was at the end of the 60s. And once again, there were lots of school kids who saw a UFO hovering and flying and switching, jumping from place to place up in the sky. And it wasn't just the school kids who saw it. There were like lots of adults, lots of witnesses around this part of the school, around this area. If I remember it correctly, one of the teachers saw it, and he got threatened afterwards by Men in Black or militaries. Someone told him, "You don't talk about this, or we will spread the story that you're an alcoholic." So he kept quiet for many, many years after. And both of them are I mean, the kids, who are, of course, now old men and women, still stand by their stories. And I believe them. I'm sure both of these schools had some kind of experience, absolutely. I'm sure also that, kids and even adults can affect each other with their imagination, and they're talking within groups, etc. But still, what I know, there's never been anyone who have come out and said that, oh, we made it up, or it was just a game or anything. Everyone kind of stands by their experience, which is very, very cool. It's two great cases to dive into, definitely.
Yeah, and so then something happened in Sweden that kind of links to these two other stories. Yeah. So can we talk about that now a little bit?
Yeah, the Vittangi Incident in 1973. There were like a group of kids, maybe between maybe around 10 kids in total, were out ice skating, playing hockey on the river that goes through Vittangi. This is way up north, and this was during the winter, so everything was ice and it was snow. And they were playing ice hockey there while they saw a bright light kind of come up from behind the mountain, or at least from on top of the mountain, and slowly coming towards them and towards an island outside the river. The island was like 50 meters away from them, so they saw it pretty up close. And the light came closer and closer, and the kids panicked. This was a huge shock for them, especially, up there in the early 70s, they'd never seen anything like it, of course. It's totally unreal event. So they ran home to their parents, crying, screaming, and this is not as spectacular as Ariel School or Westall, but we're still talking about a bunch of kids who, their parents could, testify to investigators that, the kids were scared. Something was coming at them. Something looked like it was landing on this island, a bright light. And even here, the kids had the chance to draw what they saw, what they think they saw, which is some of the oddest UFOs I've ever seen, actually. Weird things. But there is some kind of abstract similarity between some of them. They look very weird, they look very different, but there is something with them that you can kind of sense that this is the same breed of UFO, at least.
One of them almost looks a little bit demonic, doesn't it? It looks like a kind of, they're very strange. Maybe in the edit for this, I'll flash up some of the pictures on the screen. Yeah. But you get kind of there's like a classic almost looking UFO shape, isn't there? Where you have the saucer with the bubble on the top, and then some of them are just like light sources, and then some of them are like what looks like a strange, I don't know what it is. It's a strange thing, yeah.
Some kind of Pokemon, some kind of creature, basically, kind of with legs, and I don't know how to describe it. It's better to take to show them, because
I think what's fascinating about all these cases is it really shows that it kind of almost highlights human perspective, doesn't it? It kind of like how we all perceive things slightly differently, and I think that in itself's a really interesting exercise, almost, isn't it? It's a thing of note, I think.
Oh yeah, absolutely. That's another thing I'm very fascinated by, the different perception, the different experiences people have during the same event. There's one example in Sweden which is more humorous. I think it's from the 90s. I haven't written about it anywhere, but it was two policemen up in Jämtland, I think, which is also north of Sweden, and they were out driving in their police car, and they saw a bright light, of course, in front of them, and they both contacted the local investigators, UFO Sverige, etc., and they gave interviews about this to the investigators. One of them said that, oh yeah, we saw a UFO. It was a flying saucer. It was a sphere. He could see a creature inside, kind of controlling it. He could see the alien inside it. Very vividly, he described this. And the other policeman said, no, it just looked like Venus, basically, bright planet, and they were sitting, directly beside each other at the car, looking at this one. There is a UFO flap from the 70s in Sweden where one man made a lot of people believe that they saw something else. They were actually looking at, and this is proven, they were actually looking at Venus, the planet. But he was so good with talking and explaining what they saw. So he started to add details, I don't know, from his own imagination, or maybe he saw something. So he described the Venus as a cigar-shaped ship and with windows and everything like that. And everyone around him, there were a group, started to believe him. They saw the same thing as him. But after careful investigation by Claes Svan, they could trace down the whole story to one person. That was one man who claimed to have seen this. Everyone else referred to him.
It's kind of like he gaslit them then, almost.
Yeah, absolutely. But it's interesting. I'm not saying... I'm afraid I always sound like a debunker, but I kind of like these cases anyway. I think it's sometimes more fascinating than the real stuff,
I often wonder if certain people were kind of, people that have had more exposure to high weirdness or high strangeness, maybe they can see something a bit more than someone that hasn't been, almost like they've been conditioned through, they're a bit more open to see so maybe the two people the two policemen that witnessed the crowd, maybe one of them was just somehow more open to what he was seeing and saw more than the guy next to him, or something like that. It could be. I find that sort of thing fascinating. It's it's a really interesting.
It is. So it's and once again, I never want to take away the experience from people. If they had the experience, they had the experience. Then if it was something else than something physical in front of them or something else, I still think it's important. I still think it's powerful somehow.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. So talking of powerful experiences, this is a good segue. I just ruined it. But anyway, you experimented with past life regressions. That's something that comes up in the occult world a lot. I mean, Crowley, for example, considers it a vital part of the magical system, kind of thing. But so, what was it that kind of drew you to it?
Well, I actually through work. I mean, this was part of research for a project that we maybe was going to do about the subject. So I wanted to try it out. So I went to, what's his name now? It's a very famous past life regression hypnotist or therapist here in Sweden and even the world. And I had a session with him. And I've always been skeptical to the idea of past lives. Not always, but there's like you're gonna get hypnotized. You're gonna, will this just trigger my imagination and I will start creating stuff myself? But I decided to go into the experience with a very open mind and just relax. Just go with the flow. Just do it. So this is the first and only time I got hypnotized, and I remember thinking, first of all, that I don't feel hypnotized. I felt relaxed. I felt chill. I was listening probably to some dolphin song, whale song in the background or something like that. And after he count down, he said, "Look above you," still with closed eyes, of course. and he asked me, "What do you see?" And I said, "I actually saw a starry sky, a night sky up there with bright shining stars." And he said, look down at your feet. What do you see?" And I did that too. And I saw that I had no shoes on. I was barefoot. And he said, look in front of you. And I saw a trail through a jungle during nighttime. So he started, continue, walk here. So that was kind of the start of it, and he asked me to go back further in that life. I came to go back further in that life to when I was a child, and I found myself as a little boy sitting outside a burning city, obviously somewhere in the Southeast Asia somewhere, and I heard people screaming. I think it was, I don't remember now if it was my mother or father who ran back into the city and never came back. And I could feel that someone was grabbing me and put me in some kind of horse and carriage and drove away. And then he asked me to go to the moment of your death in this life. And I was there. I lived like an old man in some village, quite simple village, very happy. I was very old. I was dying. I had family around me. And he said, "Okay, let go now. Go into your death experience. Do your dying." And I did that. And suddenly I was in this big void. It's like a big black void. I guess you can call it, space or whatever. And everywhere there was this huge net. It was a big net, and in every net it was a knot in the middle, and every knot was a new life. I realized there and then. So I aimed for one of those knots, and the last thing I remember was that I saw London, a foggy London, in the 100, 200 years ago, something like that. I recognized the what's the river? Thames.
The Thames, yeah.
And then I woke up. That was an important experience for me to have done this. I still don't know really what to believe, because I still carry within me that maybe it was just my imagination doing this, or could it be something else? I'm not sure until this day, but I know it made me realize stuff about myself. It made me realize, because at least during those years in my younger, I had a fear of being abandoned, in relationships and friends and stuff like that. And that kind of felt like very similar to being abandoned as a child in this story. So that was very important to see and feel. And I actually managed the information, because he asked me sometime, "What year do you think this is? And, what country is this?" And I managed through years, trace this whole story back to the, Middle Ages somewhere. I don't remember the year now, where there was a war, there was a big city burning. It kind of fit in. It could be me looking for something similar, but it kind of felt that there was something with this experience, this past life. Have you ever tried this?
I've tried it through different means, but not had a great deal of success. I tried Crody's method, which was, his method is just, it's almost like just do it. It's like, okay, all right. So I've tried it, but no, I've not had, I've actually thought about doing the route you, and one thing I loved in your article, you draw a comparison to Indra's net, which I thought was yeah. Could you talk a bit about Indra's net, because I think that works really well in this scenario that you write about.
I will try to talk about it. This was something I realized many years later when I was reading about Indra's net, and which correct me if I'm wrong, is from Hindu mythology, and it's some kind of view on reality and multiverses, and this it's like, in the net you have like pearls or glass pearls, and they're mirrored into each other, and that kind of then reflect itself and shows the infinite choices of lives. I don't know how to describe it now. And I felt when I was reading about it how extremely similar it felt to what I saw several years before I read about it. I had no idea about this net from this mythology. I had absolutely no idea about it. But when I read about it, I was like, that's basically what I saw. Mm-hmm. It was more kind of like ropes and the knots instead of pearls, but it felt like it felt like the same thing, just from my view, from my perception. And it kind of it made me happy to see this, both reading about the mythology around the internet and my own experience, because it kind of made me realize in one way, even if I'm a bit skeptical, that there is something more to explore, after death.
Yeah.
Or in the moment of death. It helped me deal a lot with those thoughts.
Yeah. What's interesting is I've been reading a lot recently, because I've been doing this thing called the gateway process, which is like I guess like a more scientific, quote unquote, way of astral projection invented by a guy called Robert Monroe, and it still exists to this day. The Monroe Institute, it's you do the gateway process. They do courses, they do all sorts of things. But in one of the interviews I read with him, he described something really similar as well, where his thing was moving between these kind of. He said that it's kind of hard to explain. He says that. There's these different zones that you go into almost, and one of them, he says, it feels like he said in one of his explorations that he was in this giant net, and I was like, again, reading one of your things, I'm thinking, hang on, I've just read this, I've just heard this from someone. Yeah, so it's kind of like, he said it's like a sort of like a net web kind of thing with infinite possibilities, and I was like, hang on a minute, once again. But so
really?
So that's really fascinating.
Goosebumps here now.
It's interesting. I'm kind of the gateway. What I can say is, because I've been doing it for a few months now, is that this gateway process, at least as far as I've got, works, which is a great thing. So it's really interesting to kind of. I'm sort of interested in this idea of kind of what I call municipal magic now, where when you have sort of government agencies or scientific agencies looking at kind of occult subjects, it kind of has this weird, I don't know what it is. It almost feels a bit like Cronenberg-esque or something, where you have these kind of like, this kind of investigation of the occult by like an official body kind of thing. But it's kind of, it's fascinating there, but it was just a complete coincidence that I'd been studying, because we're making a video about Monroe, and I have this. There's an interview I'll dig it out for you somewhere, but he literally talks about this net-like area he went into where there's all these infinite possibilities, and I thought, hang on a minute, that sounds just like Fred's thing.
I mean, really, I had no idea about that. The thing is, I'm aware of Robert Monroe, but I never read him. I just, listened to some podcasts sometime, and I've been curious about the whole hemisync thing.
He's a fascinating guy. He's one of these guys that whenever he does an interview, he almost like qualifies it at the start by saying, well, I'm not interested in any of this occult paranormal nonsense, but by the end of the interview, he's talking like an occultist. It's really interesting. So he starts off being very technical and then the more he talks about the experiences, the more he's talking about astral projection, basically, and he's talking about kind of these really quite deep occult topics at times. And you're like, hang on a minute, he started the interview. It's almost like he's embarrassed by what he's discovered in some ways. Like it's sort of fascinating. But that's what I'm saying about the. Yeah,
it's interesting because of course this is a synchronicity of some sorts, because I don't own any Monroe books, but this Saturday, I think it was in the morning, I felt I should order a Robert Monroe book. So I found on the Swedish site, I found a not corrected copy of his second book with a letter from the publisher to the Swedish publisher, because they sent it to be translated. So I'm waiting for that now, because I've heard and recommended that I should start with the second book. I know the first book is more, how he first came, explore this the first time, but I heard second book is a good way to start.
The second book's a bit more it's a bit more far out, as they'd say, but that's the good stuff. With Monroe sort of thing.
Now I'm even more stoked to read it now after hearing you talk about it. So
it's fascinating. It's fascinating. It's kind of underrated. It's only because recently there were some files declassified, weren't there, by the CIA, where they had admitted to sort of looking at investigating into Monroe's system, and that again fascinating. I find these kind of municipal government agencies kind of looking into things like this. I find it really fascinating for some reason.
You probably know more about this than me, but I heard a story. Someone mentioned this on a podcast somewhere, and it was a woman who went to the Monroe Institute, and she got hooked up to, and she came to this place basically. And she was walking around there, checking, chilling, I guess, minding her own business. And she was looking up in the sky, whatever sky it was there. And up in the sky, there was a big sign saying, like, "Fuck you, Steve." Something like that. Maybe not exactly like that, but something quite rude and very, all over the sky. And she came back to our reality, and she asked the people there, like, yeah, it was nice, it's interesting, but there was this big sign saying, "Fuck you, Steve." What was that? And they said, "Oh, yeah, it's there. It's a former client who put it there because he was so angry at some doctor." Yeah.
Interesting. Interestingly, there's when it comes to like astral realms and stuff, apparently, I don't know because I was never a member in the AA, I think it is, which is Crowley's Crowley has two magical orders. One's the OTO and the other one's the AA. The AA being more of a teaching master-student, a bit like the Golden Dawn. But apparently one of the tests they do, or one of the part of the initiation, is one of the master or the teacher will go into the astral realm and leave like an object or a symbol or something like that. And then the student has to then go in and find this symbol. It's like almost like proving the astral realm, or creating a connection. So it sounds sort of similar to that as well, doesn't it? Where it's like someone's left some kind of article there or object there, and I've not heard that "fuck you, Steve" thing. That sounds really interesting.
I might not, telling it correctly, but it was something like that. This was pretty rude, and it was up in the sky, so. This kind of reminds me of, I was reading about Terence McKenna's and Dennis McKenna's trip there in, I don't remember where it was, Peru or some other South American country, where Dennis manifested a silver key from his hand during one of their trips. Well, they were tripping constantly, I guess, but the key appeared. He just let go and it was there. And that key was a very important key from their childhood, a key who went into some secret compartment of some kind of desk or something like that. I don't know if you heard about it, but it's pretty wild. It's pretty wild. Yeah. Absolutely stunning. Even Dennis, he says that, Terence exaggerate a little bit, but he never denied the silver key part, at least. I recommend to read about that, because that's cool stuff.
It's like people leaving psychic artifacts in the astral realm or something, isn't it? That's a sentence I never thought I'd say. But anyway, before I let you go, let's talk a bit about your book. I haven't, full disclosure, I haven't read it yet, but if it's anything like the Medium articles, I know I'm going to enjoy it. But can you tell us a little bit about what we can expect in the book?
Yeah, absolutely. Like I said, the book is called Northern Lights, High Strangeness in Sweden, which says pretty much. There's weird lights and there's high strangeness in Sweden. And I realized, much like my Medium account, that there's not much written in English about these weird cases. So I just decided, it actually started with a Medium article about the Vallentuna UFO flap in 1974, and it's included in the book. So I wrote that, and I realized that people liked it, and I also said, oh, this is, it's not bad. This is quite interesting, actually. And I think it was during the winter of 2021, and I just sat down because I had no work at the time, and I just sat down and started to write, a lot, and going to archives and looking in books and old magazines. And it kind of transformed into this book where I think it's like 10 chapters with 8 main cases. I might be wrong there. My memory always fails me, but kind of one main case per chapter, or the first 8 chapters. And then in each chapter, it's like kind of fractals off into a lot of other smaller, minor cases, but kind of related to what's happening in the main one. And there's, UFO flaps, there's landings, there's humanoids, there's weird flying boxes, there's, angry dwarfs, it's time rifts. There's so many interesting stories. So it kind of began like a case file. I want to write about this case. This happened. But then I realized when I started to write that, I started to weave in my own ideas and, thoughts, and it often connected to Swedish folklore and quite esoteric subjects and consciousness. So it's a lot of woo in this UFO book, but it also has a steady ground on interesting observations and cases where I try to get all the facts correct, but then I often go off in some weird direction because I feel I need to do this. If I'm writing a book, it needs to be my book,
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, definitely the Swedish John Keel in some ways. Then, So if people want to find you online, you've got quite a few locations people can go to. What's the best? Where would you like people to find you?
Yeah, I would say the best one is Twitter, or X as it's called now, but I refuse to call it X. Yeah. I call it Twitter. Yeah, it's weird. So on Twitter, on Twitter, my account name is Homo Satanis, which is actually from the years I called myself a Satanist. So so I kind of kept it. It's a nice name. And you can also find that on Instagram. And with Satanist, I need to say, not devil worshipper, just a classic wannabe edgelord guy,
Right.
But, anyway, it's in the past. Forget about it. So Twitter and Instagram, Homo Satanis, and
Medium.
The book.
And the Medium. I'll link the Medium as well in the.
Oh yeah, of course, in the Medium.
Yeah.
And the book you can find everywhere. Just search for the name and you'll find it. And I love to connect with people. I love hearing stories. I love that. I think that's I'm not one of those assholes who's not following back. If you're not an asshole yourself, of course.
Yeah.
I truly enjoy the communication between us weirdos out there, like you.
Yeah, brilliant. We're all weirdos here. Excellent. But anyway, thanks so much for joining us. It's been great. I've actually really enjoyed this. I'm going to read your book, and then I'm going to invite you back on and we can talk about the book.
Yes.
Excellent. But thank you anyway.
Thank you.